Okay, I have my 1-inch strips cut and I'm ready to join them, and I'm going to join them in this direction using a stitch length of 2, and the stitching has to be leaning left. If you do it the other direction when you open this up, you will find that you have sewn them this way. Compared to having stitched it this way, you will have a continuous line. Okay, I have my 2 pieces joined together, and now I'm going to trim them down to 1/4 inch. And that angle of the seam was successful. And now I'm going to press the entire strip lengthwise, wrong sides together, and it's ready to go to the machine and to start putting in the cord. I have my strip ready to go with the cord inserted, and you can see that I'm pushing it right against the edge of the fold just to make sure that I get a good seam in there. I've put a bit of glue in here just to get this started, to make it easier to get going. My thread color is going to match this fabric rather than the thread that I was using for the entire quilt. And even if it is contrasting or not the right color for the backing of the quilt, that's not going to really matter because the binding is going to fold under and it's going to cover it anyway. And I'm using a matching thread here because when I go to sew on the binding, if by any chance some of that thread might be showing, you're not going to see it because it's matching the fabric. In terms of a foot, my machine has a braiding foot, and you can see that there's a groove right there, and that is going to fit right onto the cord. So as it's sewing, the cord is running under that groove and makes it very easy. There's some other options that you might have some other feet in your with your accessories that might work. This is actually an invisible zipper foot, and you can see that there are 2 grooves on either side of a center blade. If you don't have that braiding foot, you know what? Try this. This might work for you, but be careful that because there's just that single hole, you're not going to be able to move the needle position in either direction if you're not getting it close enough to the cord. That's one option. And my machine, I have 2 blind hamming feet. Now these actually have quite a large groove, but that might still work. The only difference is that it's a very wide groove, but it still is getting close to the cord, and so the cord will feed very easily into that groove. Actually, I have 2 different. One is metal and one is plastic. So these kinds of things, you can give it a try with your machine and see what works. I've also got this very large, this has a very large groove. This is for sewing on very large cord or beads, if you have a string of beads that are being sewn onto your garment. Ultimately, failing all of that, of course, your zipper foot, and you're going to make sure that the foot is running so that the needle is to the left of the pressure foot itself. So I've got that going, and my stitch length is set at 2. And so I'm just going to get this in, and as you're sewing, you want to make sure that you're getting as close as possible to the cord. And sometimes, depending on the pressure foot that you have, you may have to move your needle over one position to get it really close, and I prefer to keep my needle down in the down position. And as I'm feeding it, I'm letting it feed more from the right side, so that as it's coming in, it's going to really get pressed against the edge of the pressure foot, so I've got a better chance of getting really close into the cord to get that stitched, compared to I'm going to make that get in there compared to just feeding it straight in. I'm going to get probably a good seam there, but you definitely do not want to have it running, feeding from the left like that. But this, having it feeding in slightly like that, it's got a better chance of the foot pressing right against the edge. And please, please, please make sure that you have sufficient piping ready to go when you start putting it onto your quilt, because you don't want to have to start adding a piece of fabric and cording to your piping because you've run short. So double check your length before you get started. The next step is that we are going to trim the excess fabric so that we have a perfect 1/4 inch seam from the cord to the edge of the fabric. I have this tool called the Grooven Piping Trimming Tool, which I bought from hoopsisters.com, and this tool is, and I've got it on the dark fabric so you can see the information. This tool is actually quite interesting because there are 2 grooves. One of them on this side to make a 1/4 inch seam, and a groove here to make a 1/2 inch seam. So, and it's quite an effective tool because the cord fits into the groove and it keeps it very steady, and now I can very neatly and easily and safely trim the excess fabric so that I have a perfect 1/4 inch seam to put onto my quilt. If you don't have this, I'm sure most people don't, we already have a tool that is going to be more than sufficient, and that is the add a 1/4 ruler, which we've just been using for our paper piecing. And this is just as effective because you remember that there's quite a ridge to sit against the edge of the fabric. So I've got that ridge locked against the cord, and now I can use this ruler instead to get the same result. I have my quilt ready to start applying my piping. I have zigzagged the edges, and there's a very specific reason we do that, and that is that when you start to sew on your binding or your piping, if you have not zigzagged, you've got 3 separate layers that can move at different rates, and therefore it can be very difficult to get things sewn together easily. So therefore, by doing the zigzag around the edges, you're creating all 3 layers into one, so that they're not going to be moving separately, and you've got something more stable to work with. Now, to get ready with my piping, I've already got it ready to go, and it's going to be sewn on this edge. And my top, when I add the last layer, it's going to be sewn on over the top. We have 2 problems here. First of all, the first one, we have cording which creates a lot of bulk, and that is intensified because we have cording in the top piece that's also going to be creating more bulk. So I've lined up the second piece of piping. I'm just going to make a line here. That's where the second one is going to be overlapping. So I'm just going to open this up, and I can fold it back to where that line was, so I know how much to take off. And I'm just going to clip out that little bit of cord. Be careful not to cut the fabric. And now when I place this down, I've got a nice flat area to put my next piping. And likewise with this one, it's still going to be creating bulk for all the sewing, so I'm going to clip this one down to there. Same process, open this up. I can peel it back, or just pull the cord up to expose it, trim it off, and now you can actually feel that it's ending right there. So I've got that corner is just to the layers of fabric. Now I'm going to take this to the machine and sew all this down. In terms of the thread, I talked about earlier about using thread to match the piping color, and I'm going to use that same thread to sew down the piping because the quilting that's going to be going on may not get exactly against there, so if you have a different color of thread to sew the piping together, it may be exposed. I'm not going to bother changing the color of the thread for the bobbin, because even though it's going to show here, remember that once you've got the binding on, it's going to be going a little bit past that, so it's not going to show on the color thread is not going to show on the backing. So I'm just going to carry on with the same color thread that I used for the piping. Okay, I've sewn my first strip of the binding down one side of the quilt, and I have this already prepared. I've taken out the cord up to that point, and I've left this open so it was easier to get to it. And now and this also has been trimmed. If you trim the cord a little bit too short, that's okay, don't worry about it. That's perfectly fine. It's at this point that I'm going to decide which way I'm going to have these overlapping strips overlapping the other seams. The top one, I set it up so that this strip is going to overlap the side, so I think I might do that, or I can just leave it like this and have the one that I'm working on overlapping the next one. So I'm going to set it up like this, but in the meantime, to make it easier, I'm just going to use my glue pen to put a few daubs of glue down to hold this in place, to make it easier for me to get started by adding this one. And I'm going to put a dot there, and I can put a couple of dots here and line that up, and now it'll be easier to get sewing. I cut this obviously so I could have a piece to start sewing the other side. Once I start sewing this, then I can easily trim that off nice and neat.